Lance Norwood sat quietly at the back table, enduring the same laughter that had followed him for 20 years. Brad Collins pulled him onto the stage, flashing old photos on the screen, announcing that Lance had only been invited to give everyone something to laugh at. Then, right as the laughter reached its loudest point, a line of black SUVs surrounded the hotel. Bodyguards stepped out first, opening the door of the lead Rolls-Royce. A voice called out into the lobby, "Where is Chairman Norwood?" If stories like this keep you hooked, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss what happens next. 20 years before that hotel lobby filled with flashing lights, Lance Norwood arrived at Glenville University carrying a canvas bag, 2 changes of clothes, and a laptop with a cracked screen held together by tape. He had earned a full scholarship, the kind of achievement his neighbors in South Glenville had celebrated like a holiday. Yet none of that mattered to the students who watched him step out of a rusted car while everyone else arrived in vehicles that cost more than his mother earned in 3 years. Eleanor Norwood had worked 3 jobs to make sure her son never went without paper or bus fare, and on the morning she dropped him off, she held his face in her hands and told him something he would carry for the rest of his life. She said he never needed to raise his voice to prove his worth, but he should never let his silence be mistaken for weakness. Lance nodded, climbed the steps into his dormitory, and became the quietest person in a school built on noise. He was not built for the parties, the tailgates, or the constant performance of confidence that seemed to define Glenville's social calendar. Instead, he found comfort in the library, in the hum of the old computer lab, in the corner of the dining hall where nobody bothered to sit. That comfort made him invisible to most people, but it made him a target for one person in particular. Brad Collins noticed him almost immediately, the way a predator notices something that refuses to run. Brad's family owned a transportation company worth millions, and he walked through campus with Derek Shaw trailing behind him like a man guarding a prince, while Megan Walsh documented everything on her phone as if their lives were a show worth broadcasting. At first, Brad only mocked the way Lance dressed. The same 2 shirts rotated week after week, the shoes that had been resold twice. When Lance said nothing in return, Brad mistook the silence for surrender rather than restraint, and that misunderstanding opened a door he would spend the next 4 years walking through. He started small, spilling water on Lance's laptop before a research deadline, hiding his textbooks the night before an exam, taping a photo of Lance eating alone to the announcement board with a caption calling him the most likely person to disappear. Nobody in the group ever framed it as cruelty. They called it tradition, the kind of hazing they believed built character, though the only character it built was their own comfort with watching someone suffer. The professors saw enough to know something was wrong, yet most of them looked away, unwilling to complicate their own semesters over a student who never filed a complaint. The students saw even more, and many of them laughed along, not because they found it funny, but because laughing kept Brad's attention away from them. Sarah Pennington was one of those students, and she carried more guilt than most, because Lance had once stayed up past midnight, helping her rewrite a paper she was certain would fail her out of the program. She remembered his patience that night, the way he explained a concept 3 different ways until she understood it, and she remembered thinking that a person like that deserved better than what Brad gave him. But every time Brad turned his cruelty toward Lance in public, Sarah lowered her eyes and said nothing, terrified that speaking up would simply redirect the mockery toward her. The isolation worked on Lance in ways that were harder to see than the pranks themselves. He stopped raising his hand in class, even when he knew the answer better than anyone in the room. He stopped meeting people's eyes in the hallway, training himself to look just past their shoulders instead. He told himself it did not matter, that a degree from Glenville would open doors regardless of how lonely the path to it had been. But some nights the loneliness pressed down hard enough that he questioned whether staying was worth what it was costing him. The lowest point came during his final year, when Lance spent 3 weeks preparing a presentation for a class that could determine his standing for graduate recommendations. Brad and his group had learned about the presentation through a mutual acquaintance, and on the morning Lance was scheduled to speak, someone had tampered with the projector file, replacing his slides with images meant to humiliate him in front of the entire lecture hall. Lance stood at the front of the room while laughter rippled through rows of students who had barely spoken 2 words to him in 4 years. Brad did not even bother hiding his satisfaction, telling classmates afterward that a person like Lance would never survive an interview with a real company, let alone build a career worth respecting. That night, Lance called his mother and told her he was done, that he wanted to withdraw before the semester ended and find work somewhere no one knew his name. Eleanor was sicker than she let on by that point, though she kept the diagnosis from her son because she refused to let her own body become another reason for him to give up. She listened to him on the phone, and when he finished, she asked him one question that changed the direction of the rest of his life. She asked him what Brad Collins would have to say about himself 20 years from now if Lance disappeared quietly and let him win. Lance had no answer, and Eleanor filled the silence with words he would repeat to himself during every difficult year that followed. She told him that people like Brad wanted him gone because his existence made their own emptiness impossible to ignore, and that leaving now would only hand them the one thing they wanted most, the final say over who Lance Norwood was allowed to become. He stayed. He finished the semester, submitted every remaining assignment, and walked across the graduation stage in a pair of shoes that had been resoled a 3rd time. Brad and his friends laughed from the crowd as Lance's name was announced, loud enough that people 2 rows away turned to look. Only Eleanor stood in the back, clapping with hands that trembled from more than pride, though Lance would not understand the full weight of that trembling until months later. He left Glenville without saying goodbye to anyone, not out of bitterness, but because he had nothing left to prove to people who had already decided who he was. He carried his degree, his canvas bag, and a promise he made to himself on the drive out of town, a promise that he would build something so undeniable that his silence could never again be confused with failure. He did not know yet what that something would look like, only that it would require him to disappear from Glenville completely and rebuild himself somewhere no one was watching. The drive to Atlanta took most of a day, and Lance spent it replaying every insult, every laugh, every moment the people around him chose comfort over decency. He did not replay them out of anger, though anger was certainly there, but because he wanted to remember exactly how it felt to be underestimated, so that feeling could become fuel rather than a wound. Eleanor had taught him that resentment left unchecked would burn a person from the inside, but resentment shaped into purpose could build something that outlasted every person who had ever doubted him. He rented a single room above a laundromat, the kind of place where the walls thinned every sound from the street below into a constant hum he eventually stopped noticing. During the day, he worked warehouse shifts that started before sunrise, loading trucks with cargo bound for cities he would never see, and at night he sat in the public library until the staff politely reminded him closing time had passed. He taught himself programming from second-hand textbooks and free online courses, filling notebooks with diagrams of supply routes and delivery systems that made no sense to anyone but him. Lance noticed something during those warehouse shifts that stayed with him long after the exhaustion faded. The small transportation companies he worked alongside still ran on outdated systems, phone calls scribbled onto paper logs, drivers guessing at routes because nobody had given them better information, food spoiled before it reached its destination, trucks burned unnecessary fuel driving routes that made no logical sense. He watched grown men lose their jobs over mistakes that better technology could have prevented entirely, and somewhere in those long nights he began sketching the outline of a system that could fix what he saw breaking around him every single day. He did not yet know that this notebook full of diagrams would eventually become a company worth billions, or that the same quiet discipline his mother had once described to him on a college drop-off morning would carry him through years of rejection most people never see. All he knew, standing in that small room above the laundromat with sore hands and a cracked laptop screen, was that the promise he made driving out of Glenville was no longer just a promise. It had become the only direction left worth walking toward. For the next 2 years, Lance carried his notebook everywhere, refining the same idea until it stopped looking like a sketch and started looking like something a serious person might actually invest in. He built a working demonstration on a borrowed laptop, a rough version of a system that could track delivery trucks in real time, predict delays before they happened, and reroute drivers around traffic and weather without a single phone call. He believed the idea was strong enough to speak for itself, and in some ways it was, but he quickly learned that ideas rarely survive first contact with rooms full of people who had never once been forced to prove their worth from nothing. He requested meetings with investors across Atlanta, sending emails late at night after his warehouse shifts ended, wearing the only blazer he owned to presentations that sometimes lasted less than 10 minutes. Most investors declined before he finished his second sentence, citing his lack of a formal business background or his absence of connections inside the logistics industry. A few were polite about their rejection, and a few were not. But none of those early meetings hurt as much as the one that took place inside a glass office on the 15th floor of a downtown building. A meeting Lance would remember in detail for the rest of his life. The investor across the table barely looked at the laptop Lance had set up to run his demonstration. Instead, he asked where Lance had gone to business school, and when Lance explained that his education came from Glenville University with a degree in computer science rather than an elite finance program, the man leaned back in his chair with an expression Lance recognized instantly, the same expression Brad Collins used to wear right before delivering an insult disguised as an observation. The investor told him plainly that people invest in networks as much as ideas, and that a young man without the right last name or the right handshake from the right circles would struggle to convince anyone that his system deserved millions of dollars in funding. Lance thanked him for his time, closed his laptop, and walked 6 blocks to the bus stop before allowing himself to feel the full weight of what had just happened. That meeting became the 15th rejection in a row, and for the first time since leaving Glenville, Lance considered whether the promise he made to himself during that long drive to Atlanta had been naive. He thought about the men he worked beside in the warehouse, good men who deserved better tools than the ones their companies gave them, and he thought about his mother, still working despite a body that seemed to tire more easily with each passing month. He never told her about the rejections in detail, only that things were taking longer than expected, because some part of him already sensed that Eleanor was fighting a battle of her own that she had chosen not to share with him. Eleanor Norwood passed away during the spring of that same year, and the diagnosis she had kept hidden for nearly 3 years finally explained the exhaustion Lance had noticed, but never fully understood. He stood at her funeral surrounded by relatives and neighbors who remembered her as a woman who worked 3 jobs without ever complaining about a single one of them, and he realized that everything he had built up to that point, and everything he still hoped to build, existed because of a promise she made him believe in long before anyone else would. Standing at her grave, Lance made a quiet decision that had nothing to do with grief alone. He decided the system he had spent years refining would carry her name, not as a tribute frozen in sadness, but as something living, something that would keep working long after either of them was gone. He renamed the project Eleanor that same week, and though the name would later evolve into something more corporate once outside investors became involved, the original spirit of it never changed. He returned to pitching the idea with a new kind of urgency, not because he suddenly had more confidence, but because failure had stopped feeling like the worst possible outcome. The worst outcome had already happened, and everything after that felt like something he could survive. His 16th investor meeting took place in a modest office that looked nothing like the glass towers he had visited before, and the woman sitting across from him introduced herself as Gloria Whitfield. She had spent years building her own company after being turned away by larger funds who doubted a woman with her background could manage serious capital, and she listened to Lance's presentation without interrupting a single time. When he finished, she did not ask about his education or his family connections. She asked him one question only: whether the system actually worked outside of a controlled demonstration, and Lance told her the truth, that it had never been tested in a real business, under real pressure. Gloria offered him something no other investor had, a chance to prove it. She connected him with a struggling grocery chain on the verge of bankruptcy, a company losing money every week due to spoiled inventory and inefficient delivery routes. Lance installed his system across their supply chain and spent the next 3 months adjusting it in real time, sleeping in his office more nights than not, watching data patterns the way other people watch television. Within that period, the chain cut its spoilage nearly in half, reduced fuel costs across its fleet, and shortened average delivery times enough that customers began noticing improvements before management even explained what had changed. Gloria reviewed the results herself before committing a single dollar, and once she was satisfied, she invested in Lance without hesitation. Norwood Global Systems began inside a rented warehouse with second-hand desks and a handful of employees who understood exactly what it meant to be underestimated. Some had immigrated with degrees that American companies refused to recognize. Some had dropped out of college to support their families and never returned. Lance built his first team out of people the rest of the industry had already dismissed, and in doing so, he built a company that understood urgency in a way competitors never could. The growth that followed happened faster than even Gloria anticipated. What started with grocery delivery expanded into pharmaceuticals, then medical equipment, then commercial aviation logistics, and eventually defense supply chains that required security clearances Lance never imagined he would need. Norwood Global became the invisible framework behind thousands of businesses, yet very few people outside those industries recognized the name attached to it. Lance avoided interviews, declined photography requests, and kept his public presence so minimal that financial journalists began referring to him as the quiet billionaire nobody could picture. He preferred it that way, not out of shame, but because he had learned long ago that visibility invited the kind of scrutiny that had once been used against him, and he saw no reason to give anyone that opportunity twice. 20 years after his graduation from Glenville, Brad Collins organized a reunion at the Grand Glenville Hotel, though his own circumstances had grown far less impressive than the image he presented to old classmates. The family transportation company he inherited was buried in debt, and Brad had spent years covering that reality with expensive clothes and exaggerated stories about deals that mostly existed in conversation rather than paperwork. When he searched for information about Lance ahead of the reunion, he found almost nothing beyond an outdated university profile, and that absence of information convinced him that Lance had simply faded into the same obscurity he always expected from him. What Brad did not know, and had no reason to suspect, was that Norwood Global Systems had already begun reviewing an acquisition of Collins Freight months earlier, identified through routine market analysis as a struggling regional carrier with valuable contracts buried beneath poor management. The final signing had been scheduled independently at a separate office downtown, set for that same week purely because both legal teams happened to be available then, with no connection whatsoever to Brad's party or his intentions. Lance learned of the overlap through a routine briefing from his legal department, and rather than treating it as coincidence, he saw it as an opportunity to observe his former classmates without anyone recognizing the man standing in front of them, knowing his own executive team would be arriving nearby that same evening to collect him once the appointment drew close. Brad told Derek and Megan privately that the reunion needed a highlight, something memorable enough that people would talk about it for years afterward, and he decided that highlight would be built entirely around humiliating Lance one final time. Megan agreed to record the entire moment for her social media accounts, convinced that footage of the reunion's forgotten Outcast would generate more attention than anything else that evening. Brad spent days preparing a slideshow of old photographs, confident that Lance's presence would confirm exactly what he wanted everyone to believe, that 2 decades had changed nothing about the boy nobody in that school ever respected. Lance received the invitation and understood immediately that it might be exactly what it appeared to be, a trap dressed up as nostalgia. He decided to attend anyway, partly because he intended to announce a scholarship fund in his mother's name at the right moment, and partly because he wanted to know, once and for all, whether people capable of that much cruelty were capable of change. He arrived without security, dressed simply, and asked his staff to withhold his identity from hotel management, wanting to witness the evening as an ordinary guest rather than as the chairman everyone in that ballroom unknowingly depended on. The moment Brad spotted him near the entrance, his expression shifted into something close to satisfaction, the same expression Lance remembered from 20 years earlier. Derek asked, loud enough for nearby tables to hear, whether Lance still worked delivery jobs for a living, and Megan raised her phone to capture his reaction, already narrating captions in her head for later. Sarah Pennington noticed him standing alone near the back of the room, and something in her expression suggested she remembered exactly the guilt she carried from years earlier, though she hesitated before approaching him, uncertain whether an apology after 2 decades would mean anything at all. She finally crossed the room and began speaking, telling Lance she had thought about that year more times than she could count, and that she regretted every moment she stayed silent while he endured things no one should have had to endure alone. Before she could finish, Brad's voice rose above the crowd, calling Lance up toward the stage with the same performative enthusiasm he once used to announce his cruelest jokes. Sarah's words trailed behind them as Brad guided Lance toward a stage already prepared with a screen glowing white, waiting for the first slide. The first photograph appeared on the screen, an image of Lance eating alone in the university dining hall, captured from an angle that made him look smaller than he actually was. A ripple of laughter moved through the room, hesitant at first, then growing bolder as more people realized they were expected to participate. Brad narrated each photograph as though presenting a documentary, describing the ruined research paper from the water incident and the sabotaged presentation that had once nearly convinced Lance to abandon his education entirely. He turned every memory of real suffering into a punchline, and the crowd rewarded him with exactly the reaction he wanted. Then the screen changed again, this time showing a photograph taken just minutes earlier that evening, Lance walking through the hotel entrance in the same simple clothing he had worn all night. Brad placed it beside the old dining hall photograph, side by side, and told the room that 20 years had apparently done nothing to change the reunion's forgotten outcast. Some people laughed harder at this than at anything before it, though a few faces in the crowd had gone quiet, sensing something uncomfortable in watching a grown man mock another grown man this openly. Brad reached into his jacket and produced an envelope, holding it above his head like a trophy before pressing it into Lance's hand, announcing to the room that he had personally arranged financial assistance for a classmate who clearly still needed it. Inside the envelope, Lance found exactly $5 and a single bus ticket, and Brad's laughter rang out across the ballroom as though this were the cleverest joke he had ever constructed. He then gestured toward hotel security standing near the entrance and told them the evening's entertainment had officially concluded, that it was time to escort Lance out. Lance stood at the center of that stage, surrounded by the same laughter and the same silence he remembered from 20 years earlier, and for a brief moment, every emotion from that lecture hall returned at once. The humiliation, the isolation, the quiet fury he had trained himself never to show. He looked down at the bus ticket in his hand, then lifted his eyes toward Brad, and spoke the words Brad himself had once said to him during their final year at Glenville, delivered slowly and without anger, as a question rather than an accusation. Someone like me will never have a voice in a place like this. That's what you told me once. Do you still believe that? Brad opened his mouth to respond, though no answer came, because at that exact moment, headlights swept across the tall windows lining the ballroom, cutting through the low evening light outside. A low rumble of engines grew louder from the parking area, and several guests near the windows turned to look, murmuring questions to each other about what appeared to be an unusually long line of vehicles pulling into the hotel entrance. The first vehicle to stop was a black Rolls-Royce, followed immediately by a row of armored black SUVs that seemed to stretch the entire length of the entrance, filling the driveway with more security personnel than most people in that ballroom had ever seen outside of television broadcasts. Guests abandoned their seats entirely now, pressing toward the windows, phones raised, whispering theories about which celebrity or executive might have arrived at the wrong event by mistake. A team of men in dark suits stepped out first, moving with practiced coordination toward the hotel entrance, followed by a small group of executives Lance recognized immediately as his own leadership team, arriving to collect him ahead of the signing appointment scheduled downtown that evening. Behind them walked members of his board of directors, a representative from the investment bank managing the transaction, and two coordinators from the newly established Eleanor Norwood Scholarship Fund, along with a handful of journalists who had been invited to cover the announcement. The lead executive walked directly into the ballroom and approached the hotel manager standing near the entrance, asking clearly enough that dozens of nearby guests overheard every word. "We're here for Chairman Norwood. Is he in this room?" Brad laughed from the stage, certain this must be some kind of mistake, and pointed toward Lance with the same dismissive gesture he had used all evening. He told the executive that the man he was looking for did not exist in this ballroom, that the person standing beside him was simply tonight's entertainment, nothing more. But the entire group did not hesitate, did not look confused, and did not scatter to search elsewhere. Every member of that arriving team walked directly toward the stage, toward Lance, forming a loose formation around him with the kind of familiarity reserved for people who worked alongside someone every single day. The chief executive of Norwood Global Systems stepped forward first and lowered his head slightly in greeting. "Sir, the car is ready whenever you are. The Collins freight documents are waiting for your signature downtown." The ballroom fell into a silence, more complete than anything Brad's slideshow had produced all evening. Guests who had been laughing moments earlier now stood frozen, phones still raised but no longer recording anything they intended to post online. Lance's real identity moved through the room like a current, whispered from one table to the next, confirmed by phones now searching his name instead of mocking his appearance, revealing headlines about a company worth billions and a founder financial journalist had spent years failing to photograph. Near the back of the room, Megan lowered her phone slowly, her thumb hovering over the screen as she realized the video she had recorded earlier now showed something entirely different than what she intended. A room full of executives, treating with visible respect the exact man she had just filmed herself, mocking. She did not notice another guest quietly filming her own reaction. Capturing the moment, her expression shifted from amusement into something closer to panic. Derek had already begun backing toward the far wall, saying nothing, positioning himself as far from the stage as the room allowed. Sarah remained near where she had been standing when Brad interrupted her apology earlier, her hand pressed against her mouth, watching everything unfold, with an expression that mixed disbelief with something quieter underneath it, something closer to recognition. She had always sensed there was more to Lance than the version her classmates chose to see, and now she understood exactly how much more that had turned out to be. Brad's confident posture collapsed within seconds, his earlier laughter replaced by something closer to panic as he began to understand that the acquisition his own struggling company had been anxiously awaiting for months belonged entirely to the man he had just humiliated on stage in front of an audience with phones still recording. He attempted to soften his tone immediately, referring to Lance as an old friend, insisting the evening's jokes had never been meant with any real cruelty behind them. Lance turned to face him directly, his voice calm enough that it carried further across the silent room than shouting ever could have. "If that convoy hadn't pulled into this parking lot tonight, would you have stopped?" Brad said nothing, because there was nothing he could say that would not confirm exactly what everyone in that ballroom already understood. Lance held his silence for a moment longer, allowing the question to remain unanswered rather than filling the space himself, before turning toward his chief executive and confirming that the acquisition would proceed as planned. He explained, loud enough for the room to hear, that Norwood Global would continue moving forward with the purchase of Collins Freight, not as a favor to Brad, but because hundreds of employees working under that company depended on stable leadership to keep their jobs secure. However, he made clear that Brad himself would hold no management position once the acquisition closed, a decision that had already been reinforced by an internal audit uncovering personal spending disguised as business expenses, hidden debt kept off official records, and falsified financial reports designed to make Collins Freight appear healthier than it actually was. Brad's protests grew quieter with each passing second as members of his own extended family, seated nearby, absorbed details about the company's true condition for the first time. Security personnel who had originally been positioned near the stage to escort Lance out of the building now stood near Brad instead, waiting for instruction rather than offering any protection. Lance did not return the $5 to Brad's pocket, nor did he mock the position Brad now found himself in. Instead, he placed the envelope back on the podium, the same envelope that had been handed to him minutes earlier as an insult, and spoke words that seemed directed at Brad specifically, though they carried weight for everyone still standing frozen throughout the ballroom. "You once believed my silence meant I had nothing to say. I simply chose not to waste my voice on people who never intended to listen." He turned away from Brad then, facing the wider crowd of former classmates who had spent the evening either participating in his humiliation or watching it happen without objection. He did not raise his voice or list every person who had stayed silent over the years. but his gaze moved slowly enough across the room that many recognized their own reflection in what he was describing. The quiet complicity that had allowed cruelty to continue unchallenged for far longer than it should have. Sarah stepped forward first, her voice shaking as she admitted in front of everyone that she had known for years how wrong their treatment of Lance had been, and that her silence back then had been its own kind of failure, one she had carried with genuine regret ever since. A few other classmates followed her example, offering apologies that ranged from sincere to visibly self-conscious, aware now that the man they were addressing controlled far more of their professional futures than any of them had realized only minutes earlier. Lance listened to each apology without interrupting, and when Sarah finished speaking, he acknowledged her honesty directly, telling her that he accepted what she said as genuine, though acceptance did not erase what had already happened. He explained that forgiveness, when it came, existed separately from forgetting, and that both mattered in their own way. He then announced the creation of the Eleanor Norwood Scholarship Fund, established specifically for students facing financial hardship, isolation, or discrimination during their education, students with genuine ability who had been repeatedly overlooked by institutions more concerned with image than substance. He added one final condition attached to any future funding the university hoped to receive from Norwood Global, a requirement that Glenville establish an independent office responsible for investigating bullying and discrimination complaints, separate from the same administrative structure that had ignored his own suffering 2 decades earlier. The room remained silent as he finished speaking, though it was a different silence than the one that had surrounded him 20 years earlier, heavier with reflection rather than mockery. His security team opened a path toward the entrance, and Lance walked through it with his board and his staff falling in step behind him. Guests who had laughed only minutes earlier now rose to their feet without anyone asking them to, not out of obligation, but because they finally understood exactly who the man they had once dismissed had become. Outside, the line of black vehicles still waited beneath the hotel lights. Before stepping into the car, Lance caught his own reflection in the glass entrance behind him, and for a moment he saw not the student who once lowered his eyes in hallways, but a man who had built an entire life on his own terms. Sarah followed him out to the entrance and asked why he had come at all, knowing there was a real chance the evening might have been exactly the trap it turned out to be. "I didn't come back to prove them wrong," Lance said. "I came back to prove to myself that I no longer need them to decide who I am." He stepped into the car, and the convoy pulled away from the Grand Glenville Hotel, moving slowly down streets that had once felt too small to hold whatever future he was chasing. Inside the ballroom, the slideshow still glowed on the screen, frozen on the photograph of a young man eating alone in a dining hall 2 decades earlier. But nobody looking at that image now saw a person who had failed. They saw someone who had simply been forced to start alone, and who had refused to let that beginning decide his ending. If Lance's story reminded you that quiet strength is still strength, and that the people who underestimate you rarely get the last word, let that sit with you for a moment. Real change is almost never loud, and the people building it are rarely the ones making noise in the room. If this story moved you, hit subscribe and stay with this channel, because there are so many more stories like Lance's waiting to be told.